Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's Matthew Flanagan, also known as the Historical Gamer. Today I'm going to be taking a look at another game here for the wargamer.com. That game is called Fall Weiss. Fall Weiss is a turn-based strategy game which was released last fall, I believe actually in conjunction with the anniversary of the German invasion of Poland. As anyone interested in World War II knows, Fall Weiss means Case Orange, and it was the code name for the German invasion of Poland during World War II. The game takes place from September to October of 1939, where the player takes on the role as either the Germans, the Polish, or the Soviet Union during that campaign in Poland. The game is published and made by a company called Wasteland Interactive. You can find it on Paradox's website Gamersgate, and it is also currently up for greenlight on Steam, which is kind of a neat thing because there aren't a whole lot of war games that are up for greenlight on Steam, so it's definitely something that I'd recommend checking it out, especially if you are someone who enjoys Steam and maybe wants to see Steam include a more wide variety of games, including games that us war gamers really would enjoy. Now the game basically gives you, as I said, the option of playing as the Polish, the Germans, and the Russians. There's a few limited selections. There's only a couple of scenarios which give you a few variations in how the game plays, essentially, and different scenarios, if you will. So, for example, in one scenario you can have the Polish get extra troops, simulating an early Polish mobilization, simulating no Russian invasion in eastern Poland, or simulating a French and British attack on western Germany earlier, which would obviously relieve some of the pressure against Poland. But in this playthrough, this AAR, I'm going to go ahead and play as the Germans in just the historical scenario. Now the game gives you the option of using basically 2D contours where they have pictures of units drawn out, or typical kind of sort of place card unit maps, contours, or however you phrase that, where it's kind of like a NATO contour from like a board game. I'm going to use kind of that Panzer Corps look where you've got the 2D textures drawn out, but as you zoom out you do see the flags or symbols of the various countries. I found it interesting that the game quite prevalently uses the swastika. A lot of games shy away from that and instead put an iron cross. Obviously the swastika is more historically accurate. I would imagine that makes the game a little bit more difficult to sell in Germany, or maybe they just have a different version of the game in Germany since it is illegal to display the swastika. But anyway, here we're looking at the main map of Poland. The scenario has you set up with a main force in the north, Army Group North, and a main force in the south, Army Group South, which did historically penetrate into Poland, link up around Warsaw, and cut off the bulk of the Polish army to the west. The Germans kind of had a blocking force in the center of Poland, which didn't do a whole lot other than dissuade the Polish from invading Germany itself. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead and take on the role of the Germans and kind of follow the historical route of invading Poland, with Army Group North and Army Group South's main objective reaching up around Warsaw. My main objective in this game is going to be to essentially destroy as many Polish troops as possible, encircle as many Polish troops as possible, and drive on Warsaw, destroying as much of the Polish army as possible. So we'll see how successful I am in that. You can see here the hex maps kind of show you zones of control. So obviously, if you can get that zone around the Polish, then you can go ahead and surround them, cut off supply, which is a valid point in this game, and more easily destroy them. One thing that I do think I really enjoy about the game is the ability to have multiple units attack a single unit at once. You see here we've got 4 regiments all attacking this lone Polish cavalry unit here, which is something that a lot of turn-based games don't really simulate. It is important to note here on the bottom of the screen you get a odds or a ratio of any given attack. Never attack with a 1-to-1 ratio. You will get slaughtered. You always want to attack with a significant advantage in your ratio. There you see 7-to-1. That is actually the highest it will go, and you get some numbers that kind of bear out how strong your attack is next to those ratios. But as you can see there, that 7-to-1 attack overwhelmed that Polish cavalry regiment and destroyed it. So that's a good start here to the invasion of Poland in the north, with destroying a lone Polish cavalry regiment and continuing my advance into Poland. I'm not as aggressive as perhaps I could be in this game. I don't like launching attacks unless I've got 7-1 or very near close to 7-1 odds, because it just seems like the defender just really punishes you pretty heavily if you don't go for that. And as this is not a game where you purchase new units, you can get reinforcements for your existing units, but you're not going to be purchasing brand new units. I don't like wasting my troops' lives in fruitless attacks unless there's a pretty obvious and clear point here. Now, as you can see, I don't quite have the 7-to ratio that I want, the 7-to-1 ratio that I want. So what I'm going to attempt to do here is bring in a few units to try and bomb this unit that I'm trying to attack, this Polish cavalry unit, and lessen its strength here. I think I actually just chose the wrong unit that I wanted to bomb for that first one. And as you see there, that airstrike was intercepted. So there are zones of control for air units where enemy aircraft can intercept your bombers and do damage and prevent them from damaging the unit you want to attack, and they did do that in that case, and again here. So my airstrikes are not being all that effective against the Polish here. They're not doing a whole lot of damage, and of course the one unit I bomb, which I'm not actually trying to prepare for an attack, doesn't have an intercepting unit there. I just kind of briefly turned on the air superiority map, but anyway, so as you can see here, I've used up these air units in the rear. That's another difference between games like Panzer Corps, is it's kind of more of an operational level game. Your air units are not up front, literally over the top of the units you're bombing. They stay back at their air bases, and then you just select them, and then it gives you kind of the range of where they can bomb, but it represents where those units are based. So that's kind of a nice little, I guess you could say, historically accurate look at the game, in the sense that you don't have air units flying all over. They stay where they really are. They strike out at their target, they return to their base, and that's where they stay on the map. Now, this is the first game in what is, at least has been said, this is the first game in what will be a series of games. I believe it's called the Campaign Series, where Wasteland Interactive visits different historical campaigns. I believe my research implies Wasteland Interactive, they're definitely based out of Europe. I believe they're based out of Poland, which makes sense why they focus on this as their first game in the campaign series. It would be kind of neat to see them expand this to other World War II campaigns, and if you look through the map, you know, units from all the countries around are represented, even if they don't partake in this engagement. So there seems to be a lot of room for growth there, but it's an amazing map. You know, it's over 700 hexes, and we're just talking about the invasion of Poland here, one of the smaller campaigns in World War II. So the units are typically on regimental scale, so that's another thing that's different from games like Panzer Corps, where units are more abstract, or not really even Panzer Corps, I would say that's the case for most hex-based games, is unit size tends to be abstract. Most games tend to have abstract unit sizes, whether they be space war games, whether they be just regular hex-based games. I'm thinking back to some really old ones, not really war games, but like Colonization or other games like that, which, you know, hex-based games tend to be pretty abstract. That's not always the case, but a lot of the times nowadays especially, most games seem to be abstract. But this game, you know, it tells you what the size of the unit is. It doesn't tell you exactly how many men are in it, but you can get an idea, because, you know, most units are a regiment, so that gives you kind of a nice idea of what's actually being engaged in the fight, roughly the size of the engagement. And the reason I'm going on about this is if they were to expand this game, if Wasteland did expand this game to the Russian front, it would be absolutely mammoth. I mean, that it would be at a bigger scale than War in the East, and I don't know if that's feasible for a game with hexes this small. I'm not quite sure what the hex ratio is, but like I said, there's over 700 hexes here. So it's definitely interesting in that sense, and there's a lot of room for growth. So I think I'll leave it at that rather than continuing to ramble about that. I'm continuing my attacks here in the north. Mainly my goal is to kind of get my troops around the Polish troops and destroy units where I have the opportunity to. But otherwise just get around the Polish, surround them, and then reduce the pockets, similarly to what the Germans tried, using my armor units to create pockets, and then having my infantry units come in and mop up but if I do get the opportunity with my armor units, I will certainly launch attacks and destroy Polish units, usually to bust a hole in their defensive line, but again, we'll see as the opportunity presents itself exactly what I can go ahead and do. So, we've kind of gotten through the main striking force of Army Group North. We still do have some infantry units a little bit further west here, but the Polish have a pretty strong defensive line, so my only real hope is to find some of the weaker Polish units, such as the one I just attacked there, and defeat them. One other thing I haven't mentioned is when you do attack a unit, you can launch attacks, as I said, with multiple units on a single enemy. So if you've got 3 or 4 units around the enemy, you can go ahead and launch an attack with all of those at once. Sometimes, depending on how many action points you have left, and that's one of those categories, the 8P section there on the bottom of the screen, depending on how many action points, you can sometimes launch multiple attacks in a single turn with one unit, but you can never coordinate multiple attacks with a single unit. So if you launch 4 units to attack a single enemy unit, and that unit isn't destroyed, you might be able to select each one of your regiments individually to launch another attack, but you cannot launch a coordinated attack again. So 2 units can't simultaneously attack the same target more than once, or any other target more than once. They could attack it individually the second time if they have enough points, but they could not attack it with another unit. So you'd have to kind of do the 1-to-1 odds versus the perhaps 2 or 3-to-1 odds. Now sometimes that initial attack will weaken your enemy enough that a single attack from a single unit is enough to finish them off. Ideally that'll be the case, but not always. So just one other thing which kind of adds another element of realism, in the sense that I doubt units would be able to launch coordinated attacks frequently, multiple times, in a short period of time, maybe a day or so, without serious limitations. So I think it does a good job of simulating sort of the limitations and the complexities that go along with an attack, and that's done in a more abstract way. You're obviously not dealing with specifically communication problems, supply problems, but it's simulated in that sense. So that's another thing that I find interesting and somewhat unique. So we're moving further west. This is still technically part of Army Group North, but we have moved along the main border of Germany and Poland, the main western border. We're away from East Prussia, which is where the main chunk of Army Group North advancing on Warsaw was, and we're now where the German 4th Army historically was, advancing into the Danzig corridor. As you can see here, I've got some units, and the Polish actually have some troops which are a little bit isolated. So my goal is mainly going to be to race east, link up with Eastern Prussia, and then also go ahead and defeat the Polish troops here and reduce the pocket, and then swing southeast if the troops advancing on Warsaw need any assistance. So that's kind of what I'm looking at doing here. So as you can see here by the Tukola Forest, if that's how you pronounce it, I've got some mechanized units which have the ability to possibly get behind, looks like 3 Polish cavalry regiments and then a Polish infantry unit in that town. So probably close to a division, maybe even 2 divisions strength enemy forces, if I can get around them. And it'll also put me really in close proximity to Eastern Prussia, which is not too far. It shouldn't be hard to link up with Eastern Prussia, but as I said, that'll cut off the northern portion of the Danzig corridor from the bulk of Poland. So that's one thing that's definitely going to be making things easier. I'll free up a good deal of troops to move south and help with the rest of the attack once I reduce the northern portion of Poland. So I'm going to move these infantry units forward here. Not going to really go ahead and attack anything, just kind of put some pressure on the Polish units here. You can see a pretty narrow line of retreat. It doesn't look like there'd be, maybe just one bridge along that rail line across for the Polish to retreat. And then I'll kind of move some of these other mechanized units forward. I want to try, as I said, and cut off as many enemy units as possible, and destroy as many enemy units as possible with the greatest possible odds. So as we eventually do start meeting stronger and more fortified lines, the Polish lines are already somewhat thinned out and dealt with. Now, as I said, just keep this in mind throughout this entire video. This is not a review, it's a let's play. It's AAR, it's however you want to refer to that, and it's definitely not intended as a full review. Now, real quick here, this group in the north, in the Danzig corridor, this is the Free State of Danzig. So there are these units on here. They're basically border or police units, and they're part of the Free City-State of Danzig, which was a governing body which was put together by the League of Nations after Poland became independent after World War I. They wanted to give the newly independent Polish state access to the sea so they wouldn't be so isolated, and so they'd have a major commercial outlet. One concern was that this new state would become dependent and fall back into the realm of the Russians or the Germans, and it was after World War I, and the Allies and the League of Nations didn't want to go ahead and empower Germany. At the same time, Russia was a communist state and was certainly not friendly to the main founding powers of the League of Nations, and so the goal was to make Poland a pretty, strong country. Not, militaristically strong, but economically strong. And while it was certainly a friend to the Western Allies as well, that's why the French, and the British signed pacts guaranteeing the independence of Poland. But as part of that, they wanted to give them access to a major commercial center and an outlet to the sea, so that they wouldn't be dependent upon the countries that surrounded them. And so the League of Nations agreed to create this independent city-state governed by the League of Nations with its own local government, its own police force, and its own basically control to control this city, because it was 95% German, so making it part of Poland itself presented some problems. So this independent, more or less, city-state, which was governed or monitored by the League of Nations, was given total commercial access to by Poland, so Poland was able to basically control the economic policy and have free access to the city so they could take advantage of that port, while also denying it from the Germans. That's what those units on the screen represented, and they're not hostile to you by any stretch. In the lead up to the war, the Polish police there were very pro-German, as they were German nationals in most cases. And they really did persecute the Polish minorities in Danzig, despite the fact that it was a de facto kind of like a satellite of Poland, just with its own sort of controls. But anyway, so you see that element on the screen, on the map. You don't control them, but they're if anything, they're friendly to you. There's really no reason to move into the corridor. As we advance south here, more toward Army Group South, we're still in the north, we're still part of Army Group North. You see, we really don't have any mechanized units. This is kind of getting into that corridor where the Germans set up mainly as more of a defensive corridor and less as an area where they were advancing. The quadrilateral is, I believe, what it was called, so I'm advancing these troops, but not too far forward, because I don't have a whole lot of punch to push the Polish back, and I don't want to get myself overextended in an area where maybe the Polish have stronger defenses and the ability to kind of kick back and teach me a lesson or push me back, because I really have almost no reserves in this area to counter a Polish breakthrough, especially further south here, as we start getting really close to Army Group South. So I'm just going to kind of keep these forces mainly in place, maybe short my defenses a bit. Along that long infantry line you saw, I was advancing, but all kind of in one block, because again, I don't have many reserves up there if I need to call any reserves. And as we get further south and my troops become even more spread out, they're already in pretty good defensive grounds. Many of these areas have forts they can fall back on. I'm just going to kind of keep them in place, as you can see here in central Poland. And we're moving now toward Army Group South and the main thrust, or the strongest thrust, of the German army against the strongest elements of the Polish army you see there on the road to Warsaw. So kind of in the center here is that army group, or that quadrilateral, as we kind of head south and approach the main battle zone in Army Group South. But alright, let's kind of move a little bit further south now and take a look at Army Group South. This is the most powerful force that we have in our arsenal with dealing with the Polish menace, if you will. I'm going to go ahead and use a couple units here as kind of blocking troops. It doesn't look like the Polish have any real force that can threaten our flank as we advance, but nonetheless, I'm going to put a few infantry units in place there. And then as you see here, this is by far our main concentration of troops and forces that are going to drive along this line toward Warsaw. You can see the Polish already have a couple of defensive lines set up near Lodz, and then also it is sort of halfway between Lodz and Warsaw, with which to resist us, but we'd have a much larger force than them, so it shouldn't be too hard once we get the ball rolling, as long as we do this well. Now, one thing I do like to do is look for sites for a possible breakthrough with my armored units, and then once I get a breakthrough, exploit those, drive through them, and have my infantry follow up behind. Very close to what historically happened, where the armored units would pierce the holes in the line, the mechanized troops would race through, and the infantry would consolidate and protect the flanks. So now that we have those blocking forces in place to the north, we're going to go ahead and begin moving the main body of army group south into place. As I've said, my main goal is to use my armor units to pierce through segments of the Polish line, allowing me to kind of flow through the Polish defenses without having to drive them back on the whole. So it's not so much a general advance as it is a concentrated pincer or a spearhead, if you will, that breaks through the Polish lines. And that's what I'm beginning to kind of formulate here, still with the focus of destroying isolated and outnumbered Polish units wherever I can, because the more units I destroy easily, the less units I'll have to face as the Polish fall back. I don't want to let the Polish fall back easily in good order and then put up a stout resistance in front of Warsaw. So I'd like to destroy as many troops as I can now, while sort of the strategic situation is about as simple as it's going to get, you know, as the campaign deepens and we get drawn further and further into Poland, the front lines are probably going to become a lot more muddied. So again, I'd like to destroy as many of these units as possible. To my knowledge, and again, this is a playthrough, so I've played this game a decent amount, but I haven't actually played all the way through a single campaign yet. It's not a review, again, it's more of an AAR, so a lot of these are still my first experiences. I have not seen the ability to build new units. I don't believe that's built into the game. It's more of an operational level campaign. It's not an Africa Corps or anything like that, and I know I have already mentioned that, you know, it doesn't have it's a much more structured game. It's not, you know, individual abstract units. It's actual regiments. It's actual divisions that are partaking in the fight. So, in that sense, you know, it's not like you just randomly create a new division out of thin air in the middle of a battle. And in that sense, it's very different than most games like it. You know, bringing in air support's important. It seems like one of these things here, you see, I do get some success there, but there's another unit that's intercepted, just another one of my air units that gets intercepted. It seems that quite a few of my air units get intercepted, and that the Polish Air Force is putting up a pretty good fight, and my air units are suffering some attrition here, which is definitely not ideal in the early stages of a campaign. One thing I'm not paying attention to that maybe I should be is seeing if the Polish units that are intercepting my troops are suffering any losses of their own. But I like to focus my airstrikes on just a couple of enemy units if I can, you know, isolate and kind of slowly work down the line, focus on just one or two units a turn, make sure those units get destroyed. As you can see there, I can pierce a hole in the entire enemy line and drive them back, or threaten their encirclement, which is what you see me doing here is just what I was talking about, is focusing my armored units in a specific area where I get a specific breakthrough. So I've got that pincer, or I've got that hole in the enemy line driven, but I want to widen that hole a bit if I can. So I've driven a hole, looks like 2 hexes wide, and I'm not sure exactly how far each hex is, but I've driven a hole 2 hexes wide, and I definitely want to go ahead and expand that. So I'm going to go ahead and try and expand it to 3, because obviously that would be 3 Polish regiments destroyed, which is fitting in right with my goal, and it'll make it a heck of a lot easier to exploit a breakthrough and drive this entire Polish line back just by a small break in their line. So that's definitely my goal here. I don't have a whole lot of reserves. There's a few strategic reserves, but I don't think there's much of a risk of a Polish counterattack at this point, at anything more than a maybe 1 or 2 regiment attack level. You know, not maybe more than 1 or 2, but you know, focusing on 1 or 2 of my regiments. So there you see I drove another regiment back. I didn't destroy it as I wanted to, though. I just damaged it. So I want to see if I can destroy it here. We'll push 2 more mechanized regiments forward. It doesn't look like I must have attacked with that one already. So I've got to attack individually, which I don't want to do, because I only get 1-to-1 odds there. I did drive it back, though, and at least I drove it back kind of in the opposite direction. So while it's not destroyed, it has opened up pretty solidly that 3 hex gap in their line, if you will, by forcing it south and away from my breakthrough. So now I'm going to go ahead and rush as many of these mechanized units through here as I can, as I said, to exploit that hole. My goal is to isolate as many Polish troops as I can. I don't really have anything to the north that's going to pincer them, but at the very least, with all these units in the rear, it's going to threaten some of the units' flanks kind of on the southern end of this Polish line with destruction if they don't move. So as I'm kind of rushing these armored units into this breakthrough, I've also got to make sure that I'm keeping my infantry coming up behind them, so that when my armor does advance further, you know, I don't get them stuck in a situation where their basically flank is in the air and get my own units cut off and put into their own pocket. That's another thing you've got to be very careful about. So moving a little bit further south, you can clearly see that Army Group South is the most powerful unit in a relatively small geographic area. You just have so many units as the Germans. When you play as the Polish in this game, you really don't try and win. Even the developers admit it's not so much about winning the game as it is about surviving as long as you can, and that in itself is a victory. Because if you think about it, you know, the Polish had held out for 12 months, and maybe 12 months is unrealistic, but if they had held out 6-7 months against the Germans, and they had been able to stagnate the German offensive, even if they were on the brink of defeat, let's assume for a moment that the Soviets hadn't gotten involved, even if they were on the brink of defeat, by that point certainly the Allies in the West would have been in a position to launch an attack. Now, I suppose you may not, you would wonder if they really would have. You know, the Allies did have a while to launch an attack into Germany, and they didn't. But 1 month versus 6 or 7 months is clearly quite a big difference. Even 3 or 4 months would have made a big difference, potentially. Again, whether the Allies would have been in a situation where they would have been politically willing to launch an attack is another matter altogether, and not one that I'm going to entertain here. As I'm kind of trying to gain my breakthroughs in different places and focus on my armor units, I do think it's worth mentioning that the game does another thing that I think is useful. You know, there's this misnomer that Blitzkrieg was, you know, limited to specific, very focused piercing of the enemy line and then rushing through it and destroying the enemy. It was almost like World War I was this grand campaign of long, continuous fronts, the grand offensive. That was the proof that those ideas failed, whereas World War II was the idea of shoving all your troops into a narrow corridor, overwhelming the enemy, and then pushing back, not this sort of grand campaign or grand offensive or grand front line that used to exist in previous conflicts. And you know, honestly, I don't know how widespread that thought process is, but it's wide enough that several books have been written on the topic, and one, it's at least a decade old, I believe it's called Blitzkrieg, basically deals with this notion that Blitzkrieg kind of changed warfare, and in many ways, you know, the rapid success of conflict and offensives was not unique. And the reason I'm talking about this now is because, frankly, you know, Poland is sort of that test bed where people like to say, well, this is where warfare changed, and this is the first modern example of it. You saw glimpses of it in the Spanish Civil War, but this is the first real example of how rapidly things had changed and how there was a new way of fighting warfare. And while mechanized warfare certainly sped up the process, I'm not sure if it's really, you know, I'm not a historian on the matter, but I'm not sure if it's really something that was all that dramatically different. Obviously, the role that air power played in World War II was a huge change, but it was effectively just long-range artillery. you know, it certainly changed the tactical level of battlefields, but grand strategy, I'm not sure if that really changed, and I kind of side with that book, and if I'm going to bring up a book, I probably should have mentioned the author or something like that, but maybe I'll bring it up in one of the later episodes here for this game. Um, but the idea that the Grand Front was dead and it was all about specific focused attacks, to me is a little bit misleading. I'm going to go ahead and save the game here real quick. I will say one thing is the game, I have noticed, does seem to have some stability issues from time to time, at least for me. So I always like to save it between turns, because I feel like I get, when the game does crash, which isn't a ton, but when it does crash, it's almost always between turns. So I like to save it between turns here. And kind of going away from my discussion, I'll come back to that later, but what I'm doing right now is I am moving my Slovakian units into position. So you don't want to be too aggressive with these troops. They're not the greatest. They're in many cases weaker than the Polish, but you want to get them kind of concentrated in the southeast corner of Slovakia. And the reason is you're really thin there, and the Polish could theoretically decide to press in on you and cause somewhat of a headache and possibly some concern for the Germans, who might have to relocate forces, which they obviously don't want to do, to shore up that line in the south. There's not a ton of Polish troops there, but they can be a headache if you're not careful. So that's why I'm moving some of these troops in that easterly direction. And that's the other country you take over, is the Germans, although they don't do a whole lot. Slovakia is represented in the game. And then we're going to go ahead and jump back in between turns now. So the Polish are going to get their chance to respond to my attacks. The first part of the turn is where they apply their reinforcements, and then the second part will be where they launch their attacks and then move. The reinforcing stage is somewhat slow. The attacks are a little bit slower, so you kind of can at least get a sense of where they're attacking and kind of the general results. And then the movement phase happens in a blink of an eye. So if you have Fog of War off, you can kind of see what's happening, but the Polish turn, you're not going to see a whole lot unless you're playing with Fog of War off, like I am right now. And even the movements with the Fog of War off they happen far too rapidly for you to be able to effectively follow them. But anyway, going back to my discussion about Blitzkrieg and how I don't really think the Blitzkrieg, as it was all that revolutionary in World War II, is kind of built on the premise that Blitzkrieg was this elimination of grand sweeping movements and more focused attacks, which seems to be the general narrative, at least among casual historians. I don't, I can't speak for hardcore historians or hardcore analysts of history with regards to Blitzkrieg itself. Here you see the movement phase is obviously happening very rapidly. Now, the reason I say I feel like it's false is because this game does a good job of demonstrating it on an operational level. There are certainly focused attacks where armored spearheads move through the enemy line, push through the enemy, and drive deep into the enemy's territory. However, there is still a solid wall of troops advancing along the entire front, launching attacks, launching counterattacks, defenses, still a solid wall of combat. It's not a isolated narrow front, it's a wide front with individual points of emphasis which drive and influence the rest of the front. And I think that's important to remember, and that's a big distinction between sort of that myth of the Blitzkrieg that was perpetrated at least through the 60s and 70s, I would say, and maybe a more full understanding of it today. The same would be argued for, the one real attempt, I think you could say, at Blitzkrieg was during Operation Market Garden. And pausing that here for a moment, as you can see, I've got several Polish units encircled now. It's a very thin wall here that I've built, a very thin line. So I'm going to try and kind of consolidate that and bring more troops in to protect it. but I've obviously got I've destroyed their headquarters unit. I've got an infantry unit here cut off into 3 Polish cavalry regiments. So that's probably the equivalent of, at the very least, 1, possibly 2 Polish divisions now surrounded here in the Tukula Forest. So this is going to, hopefully, not all this turn, but this is hopefully going to be my my first really big victory over multiple units. Now, right now I'm pounding the town of Kokonico, or however you pronounce that, because when you attack troops in an urban area, they put up a stout resistance. You can attack them with 7-to-1 odds and still get your butt handed to you. It really weighs urban combat heavily in the defender's favor, as was historically accurate. So I pounded them with about 5-6 different air groups, and then surrounded them and hit them with about 5 or 6 regiments simultaneously and overwhelmed them. But the game does a very good job of simulating the difficulties of urban combat at an abstract level, and I think that's particularly fitting for the Polish campaign, where the most famous part of the Polish campaign from the Polish side was the heroic resistance around Warsaw, and despite all odds, the rather lengthy resistance that was put together by the Polish around the city of Warsaw compared to their results in the open field fighting. It wasn't a Stalingrad, but it was certainly a decent amount of resistance, although, you know, the city was not turned into rubble or anything like that. It wasn't a typical street-to-street engagement. As it came to Warsaw and you got into more of the urban, suburban areas around the city, they were really able to put up a good defense, and that is simulated well in this game's mechanisms for urban combat. So, as you can see here, I'm mopping up several units which I was either able to surround or very nearly surround, and continuing to destroy elements of the Polish army. I'm off to a pretty good start. I didn't really lose anything substantial in the Polish turn, and I've destroyed numerous regiments, and as I said, I've got at least a full division, a cavalry division, cut off further north. So far things are going pretty well. You can see here's a depot. I'm going to talk a little bit more about supply depots later on in this this video or in this series, and yeah, but just keep that in mind. There's some stuff I'm not talking about right here because it doesn't play a big role early on, but the distance between headquarters and supply depots and the level of supply and how that all plays into you playing through this game. So I will talk about that a little bit more later on, as it plays a bigger role in the campaign. There, you know, kind of looking at how headquarters, your range from your headquarters influences your ability to launch your strikes. As I said, initially your troops all start very close to supply depots, they all start very close to headquarters, and it's not really an issue. As we advance further into Poland, it may become an issue, and that's when I'll talk more about it, probably in the second episode, or possibly if there is a third episode, in the third episode of this series. But anyway, going back to what I was talking about, you know, that concept of the Blitzkrieg being this focused attack and broad sweeping movements being a thing of the past, seems to me the opposite if you look at the actual details of the campaign. The only real time the Allies launched a Blitzkrieg sense in the traditional narrative, where you had a focused attack of a large number of troops and try to just punch a hole and drive through, was Operation Market Garden, and that obviously didn't succeed because the focus was too narrow. It was an incredibly strong force that the Allies had assembled to try and break through the Germans, but when you have a really focused spearhead like that, and you don't have any other general advance around it, all you do is give your enemy an easy choke point. Just shove all its defenses in there, and your advantage in numbers becomes much less meaningful, as you have to advance down a narrow corridor with exposed flanks all along the way. It really becomes a very dangerous and difficult task, and that's really the lesson that the Allies learned in Market Garden. When you look at the advance through France against the Germans, and you look at the Battle of the Bulge, they were not specific, very focused attacks. There were certainly short fronts, especially in the Battle of the Bulge, but it wasn't limited to 1 or 2 miles. It wasn't limited to one armored spearhead. There were multiple spearheads all penetrating along a broad front, and with the goal of cutting off a large number of troops and creating this pocket which would have a much broader and wider impact on the war. So, you know, and let's also not forget that that attack ended up failing for many reasons, but one of those being a narrow corridor is an easy target for air units and for counterattacks, so as soon as you recover from that initial shock, it's a lot easier to direct your energy and your focus against it. But as I said, the Allied advance through France was a broad campaign with the invasion through Normandy and then the second front through the southern of France. The combat in Russia throughout the war would often have spearheads that would attempt to break through, but it was, again, massive movements of troops over vast territories, not specific and localized. So I feel as if that myth that we often hear with Blitzkrieg is simply not true. Although there were certainly spearheads and what have you, it was not to the extent that we think of it today. So anyway, I'm back to Army Group South here in my second turn. Continue to try and expose Polish troops, continuing to try and create pockets. If I can't take the territory over, I at the very least want to make sure that the Polish are retreating. One thing that I haven't talked about is the way that railways work is in order to take a railway over, you have to advance over every single line of track. Now it appears there's sort of a fog of war element going on here because the tracks seem to be cut in certain places, which is going to prevent me from using them for supplies there. You can see on that part of the screen right there, there used to be a railroad track through that one hex up kind of near the top, and now there isn't. So there's obviously some fog of war elements which are in this game, which I hadn't caught previously, and you'll notice that the rail line isn't operational because as your troops move over it, if they move over an operational rail line, then you'll get like a little shovel showing that the rail line's been taken over and repaired and is part of your control, but there isn't that over these rail lines over here. So if you want to take a rail line over, you do have to advance over each individual line of track and in order to take it. But in this case, I may have some difficulty advancing in the south because some of these key points in the rail lines have been destroyed by the Polish troops, which is going to cause all sorts of supply havoc with me. Now, that's something I could show off in a Polish attack or version of the game. Some of those options in the lower right-hand corner can let you do different things like that. I can't really show it off as the Germans because obviously we're not in the position of being able to destroy various lines of track. But I've created my biggest pocket to date. I've got the 3 cavalry regiments cut off of north in the area where I already destroyed a headquarter unit and an infantry unit, so a total of 5 units. I've got something like six units down here, all combat infantry units, all high quality Polish units here in the south that I've now got cut off. Now this is a very tenuous situation. I've got a 1 hex wide corridor which is cutting these troops off and keeping them surrounded. So my goal is obviously to reduce this pocket as quick as I can and effectively as I can so that they can't launch any kind of rescue operation to get these guys out. But another useful pocket here where hopefully I should be able to destroy a sizable chunk of the Polish army. I would think 5 regiments is somewhere between, this is probably about 2 solid divisions, definitely 1 plus an oversized division, but possibly even more. So again, meeting with some success here with destroying some units, quite a few regiments getting destroyed. Right there you see I helped to expand my bridgehead, if you will, by destroying an enemy infantry unit which was nearby. Might have been able to lend support over there by that mechanized infantry unit, though, along the rail line. That's the weak point of this advance. So I'm going to keep advancing and keep kind of pushing the Polish back, keeping them off guard, not allowing them to react. And you know, one thing you can see is sort of a general pullback from the front lines. The Polish know they're in trouble, trying to pull back in a lot of these places. So it's imperative that I stop them and destroy as many of them as I can before they have the time to withdraw and reform new defensive lines further to the east, perhaps where Poland has more of its defensible rivers and defensible terrains that I would rather not have to attack into the teeth of. That's one of those things the Polish historically had decided to defend their country at the borders, which politically makes all the sense in the world. You don't want to give up a huge chunk of your country without a fight. That's just very hard to defend to your people. But the Polish probably would have been better off if they had not defended at their borders. rivers and their frontiers, but had rather pulled back and defended the major river lines. Now, it's questionable how much that would have helped or aided their defense, because it was a dry season and the rivers were at very low levels, so the Germans in many cases, rivers which would have required bridging equipment simply could be crossed by mechanized units without such equipment. But again, it still would have been a more difficult campaign. Furthermore, if they had withdrawn from the border, cutting off all these Polish units at the border, and these units were basically knocked out of the fight before they could fire a shot because they were surrounded, may have proved more difficult. The nature of Poland's geography, kind of with that bulge bulge to the west, almost invites a pincer movement such as what occurred here, where the group in the south and the group in the north basically cut the country in two, and then the rest of those troops to the west are just cut off. The geography of Poland almost invites that maneuver, because it is a short distance from the border, both north and south, to Warsaw. So, you know, if the Polish hadn't had their troops right at the border, they might have had fewer cut-off troops. Again, they wouldn't have been able to beat Germany, most likely. I think it'd be kind of crazy to say that they would, but I suppose anything's possible. But they certainly could have put up a much more difficult fight and proved much more resourceful and of a headache for the Germans. And the last thing the Germans would have wanted to do was get bogged down in a multi-month war in Poland, and then fallen right into that trap of the two-front war. But anyway, starting to get close to the end of what this podcast is going to be. I basically am going to run through turn 2 and then see the results as they come out when the AI handles its turn. Again, still just moving forward, attempting to destroy as many Polish units as I can. I've got another 3 units up here, which are nearly cut off. They've got a little bit, they've got 1 hex they can retreat through, but the terrain is probably too difficult to allow them to do that. 2 headquarters regiments and a cavalry regiment, and then, you know, I've got some armor units there that should hopefully be able to exploit that down here in the south. So things are shaping up pretty nicely at this point. I just wish I had more air units. So that's really all the major combat here. I don't have enough of an advantage in many other places. I still need to move some troops around to kind of get my men in place to where I want them to be. But I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in this video. A lot of this was recorded live. This part I'm adding in a little bit later. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit because mainly at this point I'm just kind of moving troops around and filling in positions. And you already saw that for turn 1, so you don't really need to see that again for this turn here. All the major fighting has been done. I've got the Polish surrounded in a small city in the south. I'm beginning to form pockets in the center, in the south and in the north. More so in the south. I'm having much more success with that in the south. Like I said, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. Really, not a whole lot of attacking that's going to occur. You can see here the Polish attacking the city. I've got 4 units coming in, and they still have a 5-to-1 advantage. I went ahead and attacked, but I'd rather not. You know, here's actually going to be a good example of why you don't attack by your own. You saw there, it just took pretty heavy casualties. Those numbers popping up in the casualties lost. But on the positive side, that city's almost entirely surrounded, and I've got another single regiment, I believe, in the south that's totally surrounding the enemy. And I'm just kind of slowly picking apart the Polish army, slowly destroying it piece by piece. But as I said, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here to the next part, to when we get to the Polish turn, because the rest of this now at this point is really just moving troops around and into position. Alright, moving ahead here, I'm just finishing up my turn in Slovakia now and getting ready for the big Polish turn. Now this is just about going to wrap up this video. So this is going to be a multi-part video. This first one is just shy of an hour, mainly turn 1 and 2 and kind of that initial setup. The second video is going to probably be looking at 3 or 4 turns, and then we'll kind of go from there and see how much more we have to talk about in the campaign, and maybe what else we can do with the series. This is going to be posted on the wargamer.com in multiple installments. So if you're watching this here and it just came up, then definitely stay tuned for the future videos. And it's kind of an early thank you. Thank you for tuning in and watching. I hope you come out and check episode 2 as well, which should be up before too long. But here we go. We see the Polish are kind of reinforcing themselves. Not a whole lot of movement this far. There's air combat going on. There's not a whole lot of areas the Polish can really hurt me at this time. There might be 1 or 2 spots, especially one of those kind of isolated pockets in the south where I may be a little bit exposed. Again, the AI turn is kind of a mix between incredibly quick, so quick you can't see what's happening, and very slow. So at the moment we're just kind of trying to get a sense. There you go. There they attacked the southern force I had there. They destroyed one of my recon units, one of my mechanized recon units, which are not great on the field of battle, but they're very fast, cover lots of ground, and are somewhat useful versus infantry, but certainly not on the defensive, only really on the attack. So there we also got a siege report. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we get into more towns and cities where sieges occur. But basically when you have enemy units surrounded and you don't attack, you get a siege report. There is simulated combat going on as part of that siege as you're kind of trying to, surround and destroy them. As we kind of look over the map, there's a lot of areas the Polish are very vulnerable to being cut off. A couple areas that I just need to seal off a few units. No massive pockets, but in the south, despite losing that 1 unit here, that 1 recon unit, we still do have them pocketed, and now it's a matter of wrapping them up because they launched a division-size counterattack of 3 regiments against kind of my exposed part of that pocket. Definitely want to make sure that I respond to that, but that's going to be more in the second video. I'm going to go ahead and save the game and end it here, and then take a look at my next video, which will be coming up probably within about a week, again here on the wargamer.com. But until next time, I just want to go ahead and thank you for watching. This is Matthew, also known as the Historical Gamer, signing out.